Well, this will be part 5 of our series dealing with biblical apologetics. As you can see from the board, that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. We're going to be looking specifically at some verses that deal with geology and oceanography tonight. If you've been here for the other parts of this series, you've heard this introduction that I'm about to give a little bit of that here in just a moment, and it'll be a refresher for you. I thought maybe this time there wouldn't be anyone here who hasn't been here for part, but there are some that haven't been here for the other parts of this series, and I think it's important to have a good foundation for why we are studying these verses in this way, and hopefully this will help equip us better by having a full rounding of the lesson here. So what we're doing here, we're taking some verses that the Bible gives generally in the Old Testament, and we're looking at how those things were written at a time and by people who really could not have truly grasped and fully understood what they were writing about. And the purpose of looking at that in that way is for the sake of apologetics. Now, apologetics is, of course, not a household term that we really use anymore outside of a biblical application and maybe some scientific applications as well, but really we don't use that word very often. That word comes from a Greek word that's found in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. There the Bible says, "But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and with fear." The idea of apologetics is to be able to defend our faith and defend our beliefs, specifically tonight our belief in the Bible as a whole, and ultimately God as the divine author of this collection of books that we have. So the idea of apologetics is to equip ourselves for our service to God, and the intent of this study is to use how these things were written before they could be understood to help prove that these things were divinely inspired. Now, of course, any one of these verses, someone could have been writing these things and just sort of made an assumption, made a theory, wrote that down, and that made its way into the scriptures, and that thing ended up becoming true. But as we've been going through this series, it's sort of a long series. There's going to be 6 parts to this. This is 5 of 6. And for each of these topics, so far, we've talked about prophecies that have been fulfilled. We've looked at archaeology. We've considered some verses that deal with meteorology, astronomy. Tonight we'll be looking at geology and oceanography. And then finally, the last part will be on biology. Now, each of these parts, there's several verses that reinforce this idea, and it's a bit redundant, but that redundancy helps give us a solid faith and a solid understanding and belief in this concept that the Bible is truly and divinely inspired by God. So let's get into the topic this evening. We're going to be looking first at a few examples that the Bible gives on geology, and then we'll look next at oceanography. So the first one here, Jonah chapter 2 and verse 6, it says, "I sank to the foundations of the mountains." We'll look also at Job chapter 28 and verse 9, where it has a very similar idea here. "The miner uses a flint tool and turns up ore from the root of the mountains." Now, generally, when I would read through a verse like this, and I would sort of maybe gloss over something like this and just kind of register in my mind that this is just deep underground, this is deep in a mountain, maybe a cave, or as Job alludes to there, a mine shaft, just something that's deep underground. But really, it turns out there is more that's being said here, and there's a lot more that is useful to know from this. There really were no major ideas or theories about anything relating to foundations or roots of mountains at all until about the year 1855. A man by the name of Sir George Airy, he proposed a model, and in his model he positioned that there were these deep underground foundations, these sockets that the mountains would be resting upon and would be part of the mountain, and that would go down into the deeper layers of the earth. His theory was that the upper layers of the earth would not be able to support the immense weight of these great rock formations that are mountains. Now, the model that he developed didn't look quite like this. It was a much more simplified version and much more scientific. This is just a rendering of sort of what this looks like. We obviously are not able to go and excavate. These mountain foundations are miles and miles underground. We can't excavate and observe that this takes place. But we are able to now use science to prove and to show that these large mountain ranges are developed in this way, just as George Airy proposed. So a couple ways that this is done. There's several ways that this has been tested and has been consistently shown to be true. Some of them go completely over my head, but one that I was able to sort of wrap my mind around was by using seismic data. So of course, when an earthquake happens, we have sensors that are positioned around the earth, and we can know when earthquakes happen, and we can record how strong those earthquakes are. Well, we've discovered that we can use those seismic sensors to record the speed of an earthquake as well. So when an earthquake happens, those vibrations travel through the ground at a specific speed. Now, as it travels through these upper layers, it travels at a consistent rate. But then as it gets to the deeper layers of the earth, it travels at a significantly slower speed or not at all. And by recording earthquakes that happen near mountain ranges, or by creating earthquake-like conditions and sending signals down and recording as those things come back up, we're able to map an underground terrain where this transition line happens from the upper layers to the lower layers. That line is called the Moho dispensation, if you care to know. But what's important is at that transition line, the rate of vibration changes dramatically. And because of that and the return of those signals, we're able to map out what happens under these mountain ranges. And of course, this, if you've been through this study, not surprised, things turned out to be just as the Bible says they are. Now, these mountain ranges, they are supported on these great foundations and these sockets. And there's another verse that deals with this that really, I think, is much more clear and descriptive of this as well. Again, in Job, looking at chapter 38, verses 4 through 6, God is speaking to Job, and he says, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? Or on what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone?" There's one more quick geological example that I want to give, one more verse that I want to talk about, and then we'll switch over to oceanography. This is in regards to the core of the earth being molten as we now understand it to be. This is again from Job in chapter 28, verse 5 instead. It says, "Food may come from the earth, but below the surface the earth is transformed as by fire." Now there have been all sorts of ancient theories about volcanoes and how molten rock comes up out of a mountain and an incredible eruption that takes place. Essentially, all of those theories held that in some way there's something inside that mountain that was happening, or something in that mountain. Many mythological theories, of course, as well. And that's what was happening inside there. There were really no theories that related the mountain to the core of the earth, or that in any way the core of the earth was molten, and that was the source of these volcanoes. Well, the writer of Job at least was able to record that. Of course, there's no reason to believe there was any true understanding necessarily of this. Maybe there was, but the writer recorded this this phenomenon that we now are able to know and understand and test, that this liquefied rock is coming from very deep underground. So let's look now at a few things that the Bible records about our oceans. After going through this study, I really became kind of impressed with how little we actually know about our oceans. There's apparently a running joke among marine scientists that we know more, we have better maps of other planets than we do of our oceans and our ocean floors. There have been very, very few observations of the ocean floor. About 0.001% of the ocean floors have either physically been seen by men or have been recorded by a camera. Even with the technology that we now have, we have physically seen very, very little, and we know very little about our oceans. So you can imagine ancient writers, how even less they could have truly understood, and that's what makes it so much more impressive that they were able to write some of the things that they did. When you look at a Google Earth map, we can see that there are some mountains and some valleys and things that are taking place. This is a sort of trying to look through the water down at the ocean floor. And this isn't because we've observed and recorded these things. These are simply satellite imagery, satellite scans that have tried to map the ocean floor as best we can. So we do have a general idea, but virtually none of this has been seen or explored in any meaningful way. And that was kind of impactful for me to understand going through this. We see again in Job chapter 38, in verse 16, we see two things recorded here that are fairly interesting. It says, "Have you entered into the springs of the sea?" Other translations record this as "journeyed to the springs of the sea," or "walked into the recesses of the deep." So let's start with the second mention there, recesses of the deep. This is a little bit more simple, and then we'll secondly look at the springs. So for almost virtually all of human existence, the oceans were believed to be just basically large bowls of sand that were just holding stagnant salt water. There were, of course, knew that there were some rocky shorelines in different places, but overall, just a big rocky or big sandy bowl. These beaches would just gradually go down and then surface on the other side. Well, we now know the oceans have an average depth of about 2 miles down. They are pitch black when you get down to a certain level, and the pressure there is absolutely crushing. There's absolutely no way that ancient men could have explored and understood what was taking place under there. We barely can today, if at all. Well, it wasn't until the year 1873 there was an expedition by the HMS Challenger, and that expedition discovered that there were immense mountain ranges, there were immense trenches that were existing under the ocean. One of those, of course, is the famous Mariana Trench, which we believe to be the deepest point on the surface of the earth. Well, the writer of Job could not have known about the Mariana Trench, or could not have known about any of these other deep underwater formations. But what was recorded there is that there are recesses of the deep, that there are these great trenches, these great formations deep underwater. And just as every other passage that we've looked at, the ancient writer couldn't have known, but every single time the Bible turns out eventually to be true. Certainly not in the time of the writer or any time near that. It was thousands of years later that science was finally able to prove this, and this has been happening consistently. So now the other part of Job, chapter 38 here, the springs of the sea. again, this is another situation where there really weren't any other ancient beliefs about there being springs of the sea. Virtually all theories and all understanding of the oceans were that the rains drained into the ocean, and that was where that water was coming from into the oceans, was from the rivers and what we could physically see. It wasn't until even as recent as 1977 that we finally had technology that allowed submersible equipment to be lowered down, and expeditions took place with that. And eventually hydrothermic vents were discovered. These first vents were discovered near the Galapagos Islands. And what these were just massive openings in the rocks. And what would happen is rainwater would come down far away, and then it would make its way down through the rock and then underground, and then be heated. And then that heated water would be forced upward and make its way out into the ocean through these great openings. That water would carry minerals and different things from deep underground, and that has allowed scientists to somewhat try to understand where that water is coming from, but it is fresh water that's being emitted into the ocean from underwater. Science is finally catching up with what the Bible recorded thousands and thousands of years ago. Our final consideration is going to be something that's sort of subtly mentioned here in Psalm chapter 8. This is going to be in reference to ocean currents. There really, once more, there were no theories, no concept that the oceans had any sort of consistency, any sort of patterns or currents or pathways outside of this mention here in Psalm chapter 8. And the general understanding was, as I mentioned, that the ocean was just this sort of large bowl, or this sort of valley amongst all the land, and it was just holding stagnant salt water. Well, the story behind this discovery is that in 1839, a man by the name of Matthew Fontaine Murray was a American naval officer. He had a severe stagecoach accident which broke his leg, and he ended up ending his career as an officer. During an illness while he was on land, his daughter was reading Psalm chapter 8 to him, and when she read this phrase about the paths of the seas, the story is that he was sort of struck by this wording, and he was resolved that he was going to try to discover what the Bible was talking about here. Well, so he used his connections to the Navy, and he obtained thousands and thousands of ships' logs and records and charts, and he correlated all that data in a way that he recorded the wind speeds and the ship's locations, and he was able to triangulate sort of the drift of ships whenever there was either no wind or contrary wind, whenever the ocean would be sort of taking the ships in a consistent direction. What he was able to discover by doing that was what we now commonly know and understand, is that there are these sort of pathways and these channels and these consistent, essentially rivers in the ocean. The ocean is constantly moving and not just being driven by the wind, but temperature fluctuations. As water nears the equator, it will behave in a different way and then circle back out and cool down, and it creates these patterns, these pathways that are taking place consistently out in the oceans. The ships of all sorts and the navies around the world and all shipping logistics now use this consistently. It's a widespread, understood, and a useful phenomenon that is readily used now every day based on his work. This knowledge was not known at all until just a couple hundred years ago, and now it's everywhere. But it was in the Bible all along, and it took this man who believed that if the Bible said it, then it certainly must be there, and he was inspired to go out and find that. I hope this study has been helpful for equipping us to have a more solid foundation in the Bible and be able to use these verses in this way. I don't necessarily believe that these verses were intended for this purpose, for apologetics. It could be there for that reason, but we certainly can use them in this way. God doesn't reveal himself to us today in the way that we sometimes might wish he did. It would be much simpler if we could just go out and witness God or take someone to see God and prove him in that way. But that isn't the way that God designed for it to be. He didn't intend to be visible in that way anymore. He was at one point to certain individuals during the patriarchal period. And then beyond that, there were men and women who could prophesy by the power of God, and that was a witness to the power of God and his power. And then, of course, with the coming of Jesus and the miracles that he could perform, that bore witness to the power of God and his existence. Today, in the period that we live in, we now have the full scriptures, and that's what bears witness to God. We don't have miracles that are performed. We aren't able to go out and see God, and we don't have prophets that are out prophesying to God, but we have his word, and we have the evidence of his handiwork that's recorded there for us, and that's what we are using for our apologetic efforts in defending our faith and improving the scriptures and evangelizing as well. Hopefully this series is helping us with that, and we can utilize this in that way. If you ever find yourself struggling with your faith in God or in the Bible or anything recorded there, I would encourage you to please consider these things in this way. Consider other passages. Talk to someone that you trust and you're comfortable talking to. There's no reason to have a question of your faith. And if you ever find yourself in that situation, I would encourage you to change that, because it doesn't need to be that way. We have everything we need to have a solid foundation in our faith. If you're here and you need the prayers of the church for that reason or any reason, or if you need to confess something of a public nature, we offer this time as we stand and sing.
Thanks for watching this video. I know what you're thinking. I don't want to miss another video from this channel. In order to avoid that, click on the red button down there, subscribe, and then click the bell icon. Not only will that alert you each time a new video is uploaded to the channel, it will also help spread the channel to other people's awareness. So, go ahead, do it. Like right now, click on it.